During a live international broadcast, President Trump turned to a royal guard and asked with a smirk, "Where did you learn English?" What he thought was a playful jab quickly shifted the entire atmosphere. In a room filled with diplomats, soldiers, and rolling cameras, that single line sparked a moment no one expected. The royal guard didn't flinch, he didn't raise his voice. He responded with one calm, powerful sentence that instantly changed the tone of the conversation. By the time he finished, the entire nation was left stunned. Before we reveal exactly what happened, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this wasn't just a comeback, it was a defining moment. London's most prestigious hotel ballroom sparkled under the weight of crystal, an ambition that November evening, the Dorchester had hosted kings and presidents. But tonight's gathering carried an electric undercurrent that veteran diplomats recognized as dangerous. The Anglo-American Defense Summit brought together military brass, cabinet ministers, and heads of state in an atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions. Standing motionless near the British contingent, Major Elliot Graham embodied everything the Royal Guards were known for: unwavering discipline, silent strength, and in presence that commanded respect without demanding attention. At 38, his bearing spoke of battles fought and won, of responsibilities carried without complaint. The ribbons on his dress uniform told stories that few civilians could read, but every military officer in the room understood their significance. Graham's watchful eyes moved across the assembled crowd with practiced efficiency. 20 years, if military service had taught him to read rooms the way other men read newspapers, quickly, thoroughly, and with an eye for trouble brewing beneath polished surfaces, tonight felt different from the usual diplomatic pageantry. There was something predatory in the air, a sense that someone was looking for prey. The American president approached the microphone, with his characteristic swagger, drawing conversations to a halt through sheer force of personality. Graham had studied the man's patterns, his tendency to treat formal occasions as entertainment venues, his habit of turning diplomatic gatherings into stages for personal performance. The major's instincts, honed by years of combat experience, began to sound quiet alarms. Trump's gaze swept the room like a spotlight searching for its target, and when it settled on Graham, the major felt that familiar tingle of recognition, the same sensation that had warned him of ambushes in Afghan mountain passes. The president's smile carried malice wrapped in showmanship. "Now here's something interesting," Trump began, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "This gentleman in the fancy uniform really impressive. By the way, but I have to ask, where exactly did you pick up your English? Some exclusive boarding school, perhaps?" The question landed like an artillery shell in the middle of diplomatic protocol. Nervous chuckles rippled through portions of the audience, but seasoned observers noticed how many faces remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. The German chancellor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A senior American general closed his eyes briefly, as if witnessing a traffic accident in slow motion. Graham's expression remained absolutely unchanged, not defiant, not offended, simply present. He had faced down enemy fighters who wanted nothing more than to kill him and everyone under his command. A man in an expensive suit making jokes at his expense barely registered as noteworthy. The silence that followed stretched beyond the boundaries of normal social interaction, becoming something almost tangible. Graham understood silence as both weapon and shield in the mountains of Afghanistan. It had meant survival here, in this glittering theater of international relations. It served to highlight exactly what had just occurred. Trump's confident smirk began to waver as the quiet extended past his expectations. He was accustomed to immediate reactions: laughter, anger, embarrassment, defensiveness. Graham offered him nothing but serene attention, like a statue waiting for weather to pass. "What's the matter, Major?" Trump pressed, his tone sharpening with frustration. "Regulations against talking in the Queen's Army these days?" More uncomfortable shifting among the assembled dignitaries. The British ambassador appeared to be calculating diplomatic damage. In real time, several journalists in the media section straightened, recognizing that this exchange might dominate tomorrow's headlines regardless of any other summit outcomes. A small muscle twitched once along Graham's jaw, the only external sign of the storm building. Beneath his composed exterior, that tiny movement was caught by exactly 3 observers: his direct superior, who had served alongside Graham long enough to recognize his tells, a British intelligence officer whose job required reading micro-expressions, and Trump himself, who possessed a predator's instinct for spotting vulnerability. But Trump was about to discover that he had misread the situation entirely. The event moderator, A nervous undersecretary from the Foreign Ministry cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. Perhaps Major Graham would care to respond to the president's question? Graham turned his head slightly toward the moderator, then back to Trump. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had issued orders under enemy fire and been obeyed without hesitation. My English, Mr. President. Graham's words were measured, each syllable carrying deliberate weight. I acquired it translating government correspondence for my mother when NHS budget cuts threatened her life. I refined it during briefings with Special Air Service units before operations in Helmand Province. I perfected it composing letters to 23 military widows in the past year alone. The ballroom had become absolutely still. Even the service staff had frozen mid-motion, silver trays suspended as if time itself had paused to listen. Graham continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, yet somehow filling every corner of the vast room. As for my accent, sir, it was shaped by standing honor guard while American servicemen placed memorial wreaths alongside those for our own fallen. True tradition has nothing to do with pronunciation, Mr. President. It has everything to do with understanding when words are no longer necessary. The response was immediate and electric. Sharp intakes of breath could be heard throughout the audience. At the head table, staffers from both delegations exchanged glances that ranged from admiration to barely concealed horror. The Prime Minister's communications director was already reaching for her secure phone, recognizing that this moment would define not just the evening's coverage, but potentially the broader narrative of Anglo-American relations. Trump remained frozen at the podium, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to catalog surprise, calculation, something that might have been grudging respect. Then he returned to his familiar mask of controlled aggression. But the damage was done, and everyone in the room understood it. The applause began from a single source, an elderly British veteran at one of the back tables, then spread like wildfire through the assembly. This wasn't the polite, measured response typical of diplomatic functions. This was genuine appreciation for witnessing something rare in modern politics. Grace under pressure, dignity in the face of calculated insult. Graham maintained his position throughout the ovation, neither acknowledging the applause nor appearing uncomfortable with it. He had not spoken for effect or recognition. He had simply answered a question with truth, and if that truth happened to expose the emptiness of an attempted humiliation, that was merely consequence, not intention. As the formal program resumed, the real story was already unfolding in the digital realm beyond the ballroom walls. Smartphones had captured fragments of the exchange. Social media platforms began lighting up with hashtags that would trend globally within the hour. Hashtag royalguard response and hashtag dignitary dignity began spreading across networks. Faster than official press releases could be drafted, the British press attaché, who had entered the evening dreading potential diplomatic disasters, found herself managing something entirely unprecedented, a public relations triumph that no amount of planning could have orchestrated. Her American counterpart faced the inverse challenge, struggling to find angles that might soften the impact of what every observer understood to be a masterful demolition of presidential pomposity. Major news networks were already restructuring their evening broadcasts. Producers recognized that they had been handed a story that would resonate far beyond typical diplomatic coverage. The contrast between Trump's crude attempt at mockery and Graham's measured response offered a perfect illustration of competing visions of leadership and national character. Arabic, Pashto, and Dari weren't simply academic subjects for Graham, they were tools for understanding people whose lives had been shaped by conflicts he was being trained to help resolve. His professors noted his unusual approach to language learning, which emphasized cultural context and emotional nuance over purely grammatical accuracy. By the time Graham reached Sandhurst, he had already lived more life than most of his fellow cadets. The military's emphasis on honor, duty, and service resonated with values his mother had demonstrated through her own example of grace. Under impossible circumstances, she had never asked for pity or special treatment, only for the opportunity to build something better for her son. Graham's first deployment to Afghanistan in 2008 came during the height of coalition operations in Helmand Province. As a newly commissioned lieutenant with rare linguistic capabilities, he was immediately assigned to Joint Task Force operations that required coordination between British forces, American Special Operations units, and Afghan military and civilian leadership. The complexity of these missions went far beyond simple combat operations. Success depended on understanding tribal dynamics, religious sensitivities, and local political realities that could shift overnight. Graham's childhood experience of bridging cultural gaps proved invaluable in an environment where miscommunication could result in civilian casualties or coalition losses. His approach to working with Afghan interpreters was notable among his peers, where many Western officers treated local staff as expendable resources. Graham understood the isolation and danger these individuals faced. They were caught between cultures, just as he had been caught between languages as a child, and he treated them with respect that was often absent in military hierarchies. The operation that would earn Graham his military cross began as routine reconnaissance, but escalated into a complex engagement that tested every aspect of his training and character. His unit had been tasked with gathering intelligence on Taliban positions near Musakala. When they encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance from well-fortified positions, communication systems failed under enemy jamming, coordinates became confused in the chaos of combat, and air support was being directed to incorrect locations while Graham's men remained pinned down under accurate fire. The situation deteriorated rapidly from intelligence gathering to desperate survival. Graham made the decision that would define his military reputation and potentially save the lives of everyone under his command. Leaving the relative safety of their defensive position, he established himself in an exposed location where he could maintain direct communication with helicopter crews, while coordinating with Afghan forces on the ground. For over 40 minutes, Graham remained under enemy fire, calling in airstrikes and artillery support while directing the evacuation of wounded personnel. His linguistic skills proved crucial in coordinating with Afghan military units, who were able to provide flanking support that ultimately broke the Taliban position. But what distinguished Graham's leadership wasn't just his tactical competence. Under fire, it was his immediate attention to his soldiers' welfare. Once the immediate danger had passed, he personally visited every wounded man in the field hospital, ensuring that their families were contacted and that their service was properly documented for official recognition. The letters Graham had mentioned to Trump began during that first deployment. He made it his personal mission to write detailed accounts to the families of every soldier under his command who had been killed or seriously wounded. These weren't form letters or bureaucratic notifications. They were carefully crafted tributes that often took hours to compose. Each letter required Graham to find words that honored the fallen without romanticizing warfare, that offered comfort without false promises, that acknowledged the terrible reality of loss while celebrating the meaning of sacrifice. The process was emotionally exhausting, but Graham understood that these communications might be treasured by grieving families for generations. By his promotion to major, Graham had authored over 100 such letters. His small quarters at various military bases were always dominated by the same feature: carefully organized photographs sent by families over the years, birthday celebrations, graduations, weddings, new babies. These images represented the lives that continued because of sacrifices made in distant mountains and desert compounds. The widows Trump had unknowingly referenced included women like Sarah Mitchell, whose husband James had been killed by an improvised explosive device during Graham's second tour. Graham had been responsible for identifying the remains, collecting personal effects, and ensuring that James's final letters home reached Sarah before official notification. When Graham returned to Britain, he fulfilled his promise to visit Sarah and her 2 young children. What was intended as a brief official courtesy became an ongoing relationship that lasted years. Graham helped with school applications, performed household repairs, and served as a steady masculine presence during the children's most difficult developmental years. Sarah Mitchell would later tell journalists that Graham never discussed his own service or sacrifices during his visits. Instead, he focused entirely on preserving James's memory for the children, sharing stories of their father's courage and humor that would never appear in any official military record, but were precious beyond measure to a family trying to understand their loss. This pattern repeated across Britain and extending into America, where Graham had served alongside coalition forces in suburban neighborhoods and rural communities, in council housing and expensive estates. Families touched by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan came to know Major Elliott Graham, not as a decorated officer, but as the man who remembered their loved ones with specific, personal detail. The Oxford shoes Graham had been polishing in his Wellington barracks quarters. After the Trump incident, had walked through dozens of such homes. They had stood beside graves in military cemeteries and village churchyards, They had worn paths to front doors where Graham's arrival brought the complex mixture of sorrow and comfort that accompanies official recognition of ultimate sacrifice. Graham's fellow officers respected his dedication, but few understood the personal cost of maintaining such extensive connections with grieving families. The letters he wrote often required multiple drafts, as he struggled to find precisely the right words for each unique situation. His small apartment was spartanly furnished, except for one wall the carefully maintained gallery of photographs that families had sent over the years. When junior officers sought his advice about writing condolence communications, Graham invariably offered the same guidance. Remember something specific about their son or daughter that demonstrates their character. Explain how their service mattered to you personally, not just officially, and be honest about how much it hurts to lose someone under your command. The Trump incident at the Dorchester had caught Graham completely unprepared, not because he was unfamiliar with prejudice or mockery, but because diplomatic protocols typically prevented such overt displays of disrespect. At formal international gatherings, his response had been instinctive, drawing on decades of experience in transforming potential confrontations into educational opportunities. Back at Wellington Barracks after the evening's events, Graham's phone buzzed constantly with messages from former soldiers, military families, fellow officers, and complete strangers who had seen video clips of the exchange online. Most expressed pride in his response, but Graham found the attention deeply uncomfortable and largely irrelevant to his actual responsibilities. Lieutenant Davies, a recent Sandhurst graduate who idolized his commanding officer, knocked on Graham's door near midnight with news of the growing media response. "Sir, Downing Street has been calling. They want to recommend you for additional honors. The press is calling you a national hero." Graham looked up from his desk where he had been composing another letter condolences to the family of a soldier who had died by suicide 3 weeks after returning from deployment, a casualty of war that would never appear in official statistics, but was no less real for its invisibility. "Davies," Graham said quietly, setting down his fountain pen, "heroes are the people who don't make it home. I'm simply doing what the job requires." The young lieutenant persisted with the enthusiasm of youth and inexperience. "But sir, what you said to President Trump, everyone's talking about it. Social media is exploding. They're saying you gave him a masterclass in dignity and leadership." Graham gestured for Davies to sit in the chair across from his desk, recognizing something of his own youthful idealism in the lieutenant's eager expression. There was a time when Graham had believed that individual moments could reshape history, that the right words delivered at the right time could change the fundamental nature of human interaction. "Davies, let me explain something about dignity," Graham began, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher addressing a promising but naive student. "It isn't something you perform for cameras or audiences. It's what you do when nobody is watching, when there's no recognition, when the only witness is your own conscience." He indicated the wall of family photographs that dominated his small office space. Every face there represents choices, not just the choice they're loved, one made to serve, but decisions I made about how to honor that service appropriately. Writing letters isn't heroic. Visiting families isn't extraordinary. These are simply the things you do when you understand that leadership means accepting genuine responsibility for the lives entrusted to your care. Graham returned his attention to the half-finished letter on his desk, his handwriting careful and deliberate. "The president made a joke tonight. I responded with truth. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Patterson will receive this letter about her son's service and sacrifice. Which of these interactions do you believe matters more in the long term?" Meanwhile, aboard Air Force One somewhere over the Atlantic, Trump's evening was unfolding along dramatically different lines. The president had departed the Dorchester earlier than originally scheduled, his staff citing adjustments to accommodate other commitments while privately acknowledging that remaining would have only amplified the embarrassment of the evening's exchange. Senior advisor Stephen Miller sat across from Trump in the aircraft's conference area, scrolling through social media responses on his tablet with increasing concern. The hashtags were devastating, the memes merciless, and even traditionally supportive conservative commentators were struggling to find angles that might defend the president's behavior. "The response isn't favorable, sir," Miller reported with characteristic understatement. "Major Graham's military record is substantial: Cambridge education, multiple combat deployments, decorated for valor under fire. The optics present significant challenges." Trump stared through the aircraft window at cloud formations illuminated by moonlight, his usual bombast replaced by something closer to genuine frustration. This wasn't how these encounters typically unfolded. Usually, his verbal provocations produced predictable responses that could be manipulated to his advantage. Graham had given him nothing to work with. "Get me everything we have on this guy," Trump finally said. "Complete military file, education records, family background, everything." The dossier arrived within 30 minutes, compiled by staff who understood that thoroughness was essential when the president's political reputation was at stake. What they found presented a narrative that even Trump's most creative communication specialists would struggle to attack effectively. The file painted a picture of merit-based achievement that contradicted every negative stereotype about military leadership or immigrant success. Graham's Bronze Star citation was particularly problematic for any attempted character assassination. For exceptionally meritorious service in combat operations, displaying extraordinary courage under enemy fire while coordinating joint coalition activities that preserved the lives of Allied forces and Afghan civilian populations. Trump's communications director was already fielding calls from reporters, seeking official responses to the evening's events. The questions were pointed and difficult to deflect. How did the president plan to respond to being corrected about service and sacrifice by a decorated combat veteran? Would he apologize for mocking a soldier's accent? What message did this exchange send to America's military allies about respect for their personnel? The standard Trump response playbook: aggressive counterattack, character assassination, deflection through controversy seemed inadequate against an opponent whose record was unassailable, and whose response had been so measured that any aggressive retaliation would only make the president appear more petty and vindictive. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Trump faced a situation where his usual tactics would only deepen his disadvantage. Graham had won the exchange not through clever rhetoric or political maneuvering, but through simple dignity and unvarnished truth, weapons that Trump's arsenal was poorly equipped to counter. Back in London, media response was swift and overwhelmingly favorable to Graham's handling of the situation. The BBC led their late news with British officers' measured response to presidential mockery, while the Times ran the headline leadership through quiet authority. Even traditionally Trump-friendly publications struggled to frame the president's behavior in positive terms. The story that emerged over subsequent days revealed the full scope of Graham's remarkable personal journey. Journalists interviewed his former teachers in Glasgow, his commanding officers from Afghanistan deployments, and the military families he had supported through their darkest periods. Each conversation added depth to the portrait of a man whose life had been consistently defined by service to others rather than personal advancement. Mrs. Henderson, Graham's former English literature teacher, was particularly eloquent when contacted by reporters. Elliot was always special, not because he was more intelligent than other students, but because he understood even as a child that education was a responsibility, not merely an opportunity. He learned English not for personal benefit, but to serve as a voice for people who needed advocacy. The revelation of Graham's linguistic capabilities added another dimension to the story that made Trump's mockery seem even more tone-deaf. His fluency in Arabic, Pashto, and Dowry represented years of dedicated study motivated by a desire to understand and effectively serve people whose lives had been devastated by conflicts he was trained to help resolve. Colonel Sarah Thompson, Graham's former commanding officer in Afghanistan, provided context that illuminated the true scope of his contributions. Major Graham saved American lives through his cultural understanding and communication skills. She told international media, his ability to bridge language barriers and navigate cultural sensitivities was literally the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure on multiple occasions. The interviews revealed a consistent pattern throughout Graham's career: excellence achieved not for personal recognition, but in service to others. His Cambridge degree, his military decorations, his diplomatic assignments each represented duty fulfilled rather than ambition satisfied. As the week following the Dorchester incident concluded, the contrast between Trump's public persona and Graham's quiet authority had become a subject of international commentary and analysis. Editorial writers and political commentators found in Graham's response a template for handling bullying and provocation, not through escalation or retaliation, but through dignified truth-telling that exposed the emptiness of calculated attacks. The letters Graham had referenced continued to arrive at homes across Britain and America, written in his careful handwriting and describing specific memories of courage and sacrifice that official records could never capture. These quiet acts of remembrance continued without media attention, noticed only by the people who mattered most, the families who had given everything for their nation's security. In the end, the incident that lasted less than 5 minutes at a London hotel would be remembered long after diplomatic summits and political controversies had faded from public memory. It served as a reminder that in an era of manufactured outrage and endless noise, the most powerful responses are often the most measured ones, and that true strength reveals itself not in volume, but in the quiet certainty of knowing when words are no longer necessary.